I want to welcome you to Canyon Creek Church, especially those of you that are watching from our Everett campus or our Palouse campus, or you're watching this online or listening to this podcast. It means a lot to me that you've chosen to join Canyon Creek Church this weekend. You've joined us in the middle of a series that we started about several weeks ago called Jesus Said What? And what we're doing is we're looking at things that Jesus actually said, but maybe you weren't really sure that he said it, or you never really understood the implication of Jesus saying this, what it should mean for you and I. And many of these Jesus said what sermons that we've done have come from Jesus' most famous sermon. And his absolute most famous sermon that he ever preached is called the Sermon on the Mount. And we have taken several of the messages from the Sermon on the Mount, and we have included them in this series over the last several weeks. And in Matthew chapter 5:17, this kind of begins from the Sermon on the Mount, this portion of the Sermon on the Mount that I want to highlight today. This is kind of the introduction. This is what Jesus was, he was making his thesis statement, and then he was summing it up afterwards. And here it is. He says this, verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. He said, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I think one of the greatest, I would call them modern Christianity myths, is that there is no use of the Old Testament anymore. That they are quick to say, whenever anybody quotes a standard or a law from the Old Testament, or even an expectation from the Old Testament, a Christian today will throw off this statement. They'll say, well, that doesn't matter because that was all covered by Jesus in the New Testament. And I have told you week in and week out that Jesus rarely said something like, ignore the Old Testament. Don't listen to the Old Testament. He actually would take what were Old Testament laws and actually take them almost to an extreme about following those laws. And so this kind of is in depth on that, where Jesus says, and this is, again, what gets misquoted by people, Jesus said, I have come to fulfill the law. Like, I am the fulfillment of the law. But then he doesn't stay there. Like most people, they only read that verse and then they misquote it and misinterpret it. And Jesus literally goes into detail on what he means. He said, in the Old Testament, you were taught this. He said, but I say not this, but you should actually do this. So after this, for the next 30 verses, he explains 6 different situations in which he was the fulfillment of the Old Testament law, and then he takes what was taught in the Old Testament and he says, but now is the way you should look at it. Here's the way you should look at it. He covers murder, adultery, divorce, making oaths, revenge, loving your enemies. And again, several of these we've talked about in this series. And in fact, I would say out of all of these 6 scenarios that Jesus says he's the fulfillment of, the one that I'm teaching on today, I believe is probably the most frustrating. Like what I'm going to talk to you about, when you really understand Jesus said this, this isn't made up. It's not assumed that Jesus said this. It's not like a misquotation of something Jesus said, but he actually said this. Some of these implications on what Jesus said and what that means for you and I, you're going to find frustrating, because I found it frustrating. And so let's look at the text and then let's pray together. It's Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 through 42. So again, Jesus said, I'm the fulfillment of the Old Testament law. I am it. So then he explains the law, and he then says, and this is the way you should live it out today. Verse 38, He's talking about revenge here. He says, "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." As a Christian, there are so many things that I know I should do. There are things that I know as a follower of Jesus, I should view a circumstance this way. I should look at another person this way. That as a Christian, we know that there are things that we should do. And our response oftentimes is something like, it's easier said than done. And I believe that this passage is the ultimate easier said than done passage. There isn't going to be a thing in here that you and I are going to disagree with, but when we step back and we think, well, what does that actually mean for me and the way that I'm going to have to respond to difficult people in my life, then we're like, whoa, that's easier said than done. And when Jesus said this, you and I have to understand that it wasn't a suggestion. And since it's not a suggestion, it's something that you and I need to reconcile. Because this text, it's frustrating. This text is countercultural. Literally, this text is the opposite of what in 21st century society it says we should view people that wrong us, offend us, try to take advantage of us. That we live in a world where everything should be fair. Everything should be equal. I mean, that's why one of the reasons that there is this push towards even a socialistic sense of finance in our world is because everything should be fair. Everybody should have equal opportunity, equal amount of money. Everybody that plays on any sports team should get equal playing time. Everybody gets a trophy just for participating. No more do we have an MVP or a most valuable player. We want every child to feel if they compete on the team, they're valued. We live in the ultimate everything must be fair society. But then in addition, when someone does something wrong, like we're reading in the newspaper right now, it's all over the news, this billionaire who was leading a sex trafficking organization that he covered it up for years. He's had all of these political leaders and other wealthy people have covered up the fact that he's done it. And when we read about the atrocities that this man committed, it is human nature to not just want justice, but to demand it. It's the only thing right and fair. Why? Because an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If anyone does something, they should pay the price for it. And I would even tend to say, when you and I get wronged, or when one of our kids gets wronged, or our spouse or someone that we love gets wronged, our initial response isn't to step back and think, I need some good perspective on what really happened. Maybe there's another side to the story. No, our initial response in most of those situations, let's be honest, it's anger. When we hear that someone has done something that is unjust, unfair, we respond with anger. When someone cuts us off when we're driving, how do we normally respond? We'll speed up, tailgate them, we'll honk if we're deeply unspiritual. We might say a word that we wouldn't say normally, or we might make some sort of sign language gesture that we wouldn't make, but we respond out of anger. When someone cuts us off, our first response is not to immediately think, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to let them cut me off in the same spot again. Our response isn't to turn the other cheek because everything has to be fair. Everything has to be just. But Jesus said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And this is what he's talking about. When we read the eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, we think the dude cut me off yesterday. I get to cut him off today. This is known historically as a phrase called lax talionis. Lax talionis. Lax talionis is the law of retaliation or revenge. Under lax talionis, a person can seek retribution whenever they're wrong. It represented an early attempt by culture to ensure that there was always justice and it would limit extreme revenge. Lax talionis is now discovered as one of the earliest legal systems. It's traced back all the way to 18 BC from the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a Babylonian king who wrote a bunch of laws and had them inscribed on pillars. And in 1901, they actually excavated these pillars and they saw for the first time lax talionis, that it dated back as early as 18 BC. In fact, these pillars, if you're ever in Paris, they are you can see them in the Louvre Museum. These Code of Hammurabi pillars. And they were meant, the purpose of lax talionis was meant to give an ordinary person justice in every situation, even against someone who was maybe more politically powerful than them, maybe somebody who was wealthier than them, someone who had more influence. It was meant for things to be fair and just. And in fact, we see lax talionis all the way through history. In fact, we see it in the Old Testament very clearly in the Old Testament. So here it is. Exodus chapter 21, verse 36, verse 33, we see lax talionis at work. So this is Moses trying to give the people of Israel. Okay, he's literally thought through every scenario. So he's like, I'm trying to keep all you people to get along. So if this happens in this scenario, here's how you deal with it. And over again, we see this thought that things have to be just and fair. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. A wrong is made right by the equal thing happening to the other person. And so this is lax talionis in effect. Here it is. Here's all the different scenarios. I find these deeply amusing. When a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and doesn't cover it. So if you dig a hole, you don't cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in it. The owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. So in other words, you dig a hole, you forget to fill in that hole, my dog walks by, falls in the hole, and dies. You now have to pay me for my dog, and my deceased dog now becomes yours. Lax talionis, in effect. It's meant to limit revenge. He goes on and he says, when one man's ox butts another's so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and share its price, and the dead beast also shall share. In other words, you take your dog to a dog park, and your dog gets into a fight with a pit bull at the dog park, and it loses the battle to the pit bull. What lax talionis from Exodus would say is that you should take the pit bull, sell the pit bull, take the proceeds and divide them up equally, and then the remaining dog, the result of the evil pit bull, gets divided up and given to each one of you too. Lax talionis. Everything should be equal, fair, just. Moving on. Or if it's known that the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past and its owner has not kept it in, he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall also be his. So, in other words, if you take your dog to the dog park and your dog gets attacked by a dog who was a known violent dog, that the owner should get the injured dog, and you should be able to sell the other dog and receive all the proceeds from that dog. Lax talionis. It was meant, lax talionis, the logical reason was that things should be just and fair, but they shouldn't be extreme. That, like, in other words, if you had an ox and he fell into a pit, you don't get to all of a sudden, like, kill your neighbor as a result. Because most people, when they get wronged, they respond out of anger. And so lax talionis is trying to keep people from responding in a revengeful way. Responding maybe to an extreme. So when I was a youth pastor, this is the way I would think of it. So we would go on these tours all the time. And the tours, we'd have busloads of kids, students, and it always happened, every single tour, teenagers love to do pranks on each other. And if you've ever been on a youth function, maybe you're a teacher, or maybe you've worked with teenagers in the past, you know that once pranks get going, you can't stop them. And what also happens with pranks is that one person does this prank, they respond to how they got pranked by doing a more extreme prank to the other one, and then it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So every time we would do these trips, the guys would always pull a prank on the girls. And then the girls would respond like to an absolute extreme way every time. So, for example, the guys would hide the girls' clothes. The girls would want to change, couldn't find their clothes, they'd be all frustrated. They'd finally find their hidden clothes, and then one of the guys is always like telling on the other guys. And he said, yeah, we hid your clothes, I'm sorry. And so then the girls think, well, I'm going to get those guys back. And so then the girls go take the boys' clothes and burn the boys' clothes. It's like every time girls take this thing to an extreme. I saw this over and over and over again as a youth pastor. This, instead of eye for an eye, it's like, I'm going to take this to an extreme. So, years ago, there was a TV show called Flavor of Love. Flavor of Love. I think Flavor of Love, by the way, really shows that Hollywood is out of ideas, because Flavor of Love is absolutely terrible. So here it was, the concept of this reality TV show, which, by the way, had 3 seasons. So it tells it, Hollywood out of ideas. So the idea with Flavor of Love is that women would compete for the right to date Flavor Flav. I'm going to show you a picture of Flavor Flav. That guy that you just saw that picture of, women were fighting for the right to date him. Like, my wife tells me sometimes, Brandon, I just really want you to come up with a style. Like, compared to Flavor Flav, I should be on the cover of a magazine. Okay, so women would compete for the right to date Flavor Flav. And almost every single episode, there would be a scene where 2 of these women would be talking to each other, and one is usually confronting the other. And it's usually, hey, I heard you said this about me. Did you really gossip about me? And then the person would say, oh yeah, you caught me red-handed, I gossiped about you. And then the person that got gossiped about would almost immediately respond with, I'll kill you. And so it's like extreme response over and over again. Gossip, I'll kill you. That is the way that the world works. So that was why they created, generations ago, the concept of lax talionis. because it was meant to regulate and civilize the process by with which people seek justice. And now Jesus, this lax talionis, this pretty much law that cultures for generations have been abiding by, he corrects it for the future by saying this. Jesus says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, don't resist an evil person. The NIV really emphasizes the word evil person. And immediately, this put Jesus at odds with his Jewish audience. So remember, the people that were first following Jesus were like the Jews. And there were a lot of Jews that believed for generations that a Messiah would come. But they had an idea of the way that the Messiah would be. Their image of the Messiah was that he was going to come as a conquering king. And they viewed that the ultimate evil empire was Rome. And that when the Messiah came, this conquering king, he would lead an army to conquer the evil empire of Rome. And now Jesus is saying, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, you shouldn't even resist an evil person. Jesus is advocating for them to live in a way that is totally the opposite of what they expected the Messiah to say. They thought the Messiah is going to lead a rebellion. They thought the Messiah is going to conquer the evil Roman Empire. And instead, Jesus said, I don't care about them at all. In fact, I would say, don't even resist an evil person. Jesus then goes on and he elaborates over the next several verses 4 ways that we should live the opposite of lax talionis. 4 ways. Number 1, he says this. He goes on to describe it. He says, you shouldn't resist an evil person. And then he said, and let me give you some examples. He said, if anyone slaps you in the right cheek, you should turn to him the other cheek also. So I want you to note that Jesus said, if anyone slaps you in the right cheek, you should turn to him the other also. You see, the right cheek, getting slapped in your right cheek was much worse than getting slapped in your left. Culturally, way worse. Because to hit somebody in their right cheek, most likely you had to use your left hand. And in this culture, there was a saying. Okay, here it is. You eat with your right, you wipe with your left. So when you slapped somebody in the right cheek, you were slapping them with the hand you used to wipe your butt. And so it was the ultimate insult. And if you didn't slap them with your left hand, the only way you can slap somebody in the right cheek is if you get them a backhand with your right hand. And slapping someone with your backhand is the ultimate terrible insult. I mean, think about it this way. How do you feel if somebody slaps you in the face? Have you ever been slapped in the face? It's terribly embarrassing. It's awkward. It's insulting. I have been slapped in the face one time my entire life. I was in high school. I was slapped in the face by someone who's probably watching this, Mike Collard. So I had it coming. So Mike Collard slapped me because I egged his house. I egged his house, showed up at school the next day. He caught me and he slapped me. And that's the only time I've ever been slapped. But if you've ever been slapped, what is your first inclination when somebody slaps you in the face? If somebody slaps you in the face, you like want to break their nose. Like your first inclination when you get slapped isn't to say, oh, you hit me in the right cheek. Here, Mike Collard, slap me in the left now. You're not thinking that way. The first thing you want to do is like, you just hit me, let's go. You don't think, turn the other cheek. But that's what Jesus said. He said, not only does lax talionis not apply to you as a follower of mine? He said, but you should turn the other cheek. You see, turning the other cheek is the ultimate act of humility. It's the ultimate act of making yourself vulnerable. It is this challenge for us to demonstrate Christian values over our absolute need for justice in our life. Jesus is saying, I don't want you to follow the example of the striker. Because lax talionis would say, if somebody slapped you, you should slap them back. He said, but instead, I want you to follow my example. And he said, if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, turn your other cheek also. Paul went into a little bit more detail with this in Romans. And in Romans chapter 12, verse 17, Paul said this. He says, repay no one for evil, but give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all. That instead of living out lax talionis, you don't repay evil for evil, but instead you realize you represent someone. That you and I, as followers of Jesus, as Christians, we represent Jesus. Everything we do reflects positively or negatively on Jesus. And so Paul is saying, he said, don't repay evil for evil, but give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all. In other words, remember who you represent. You no longer represent yourself, you represent Jesus. The old cheesy cliche that I used to hear when I first committed my life to Christ is that you might be the only Jesus that anyone ever sees. And that is what Paul is saying. He's saying you need to do what is honorable in the sight of all of these people. And then he goes on and he says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, like you might, like me, have a difficult neighbor. But as far as it depends on us personally, live at peace with all. And he goes on, he says, beloved, never avenge yourselves. Believe it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Now, is that not the ultimate easier said than done? This is like Jesus is saying, turn the other cheek. Paul is then saying, not only should you turn the other cheek, but you should trust that if evil has happened to you, that Jesus loves you, that God has got you, and God is going to protect you. That vengeance is the Lord's. That God is going to cover you. God is going to take care of this. And he said, and when you repay evil done to you with good, he said, it is the equivalent of heaping burning coals on someone's head. He said, it is the extreme of that. Both in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, we read, vengeance is mine. Vengeance is mine. That we need to trust God. I think part of what Jesus is trying to advocate here is that he's trying to advocate, you need to trust me. You need to trust that I care about you, that I got you, that I'm going to protect you, that I'm going to keep you safe, but I don't want you to do something that's going to be extreme and reflect poorly on me as a witness to all of these other people. Just trust that I got you. And when you respond in that way, it is the equivalent of heaping burning coals on someone's head. Now, what is challenging with that is, again, our absolute need for a sense of justice. But then in addition, we're like, well, what happens if someone wrongs us? What happens if someone offends us? Well, Jesus later on in Matthew 18, he actually explains that. And last week, Jeremy talked to you about how do you deal with a brother who sins against you? And if you missed that message and you really want to have that question answered, go back, listen to that message. He explained it incredibly well. But Jesus said, turn the other cheek. And I say, Jesus, easier said than done. But you got to pause and you got to think this. What do you want to be known as? Do you want to be known as someone who lives peacefully with other people? Do you want to be known as someone who takes things to extreme? Or would you rather be known as maybe a person, if this person lives peacefully, that they turn the other cheek? Do you want to be known, secondly, Jesus says, do you want to be known as someone who gives the shirt off your back? In Matthew chapter 5, verse 40, Jesus goes on and he says, okay, again, no longer lax talionis, but you need to turn the other cheek. And in addition, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him also have your cloak as well. So what people would do back in the first century is they really had two outer garments. They had their jacket, their cloak, and then underneath that they would have their tunic, which is basically your undergarment. And so Jesus is saying, if somebody asks for your coat, give them your coat, but also give them your tunic too. Give them your cloak too. And you would read that, and at first you would think, so is Jesus advocating that we run around naked? So he is not saying that if you're listening to this, that Moscow or Everett should be full of people that go to Canyon Creek running around naked because they just gave the clothes off of their back. That is not actually what Jesus is saying. Jesus is exaggerating. I know it's shocking. People always make fun of me because they say, Pastor Brandon, you exaggerate. Did you know that every great preacher, including Jesus, uses exaggeration as a literary technique? That was what Jesus was doing. He was using exaggeration. He was not saying you should run around naked. He was using it as a literary technique to prove the point that you and I should diffuse conflict by yielding even more than is required. That if we can get out of this conflict by doing this, we should actually go one step further and do this. That we should avoid fighting with our neighbors, avoid fighting with our enemies, avoid fighting with our friends. That give the shirt off your back. And you and I would say, Jesus, that one's easier said than done. But I ask, what do you want to be known as? Would you rather be known as someone that fights to always be right? Or would you rather be known as someone who gives the shirt off your back? Jesus is also saying, not only should you be known as someone who turns the other cheek, gives the shirt off your back, but you should also be known as the person who goes the extra mile. He says in verse 41, and if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, you should go with him 2 miles. I think you're going to find this one pretty interesting because a Roman mile was 1,000 paces. And so 1 pace is the equivalent of like 5 steps today. You know, most of us on our smartphone, we have these apps that keep track of the number of steps. And I don't know about you, but Di and I try to walk at least 10,000 steps a day. So if you quickly do the math, 10,000 divided by 5, 2,000, which means we would be going 2 Roman miles based upon that. And what Roman law permitted is that in any circumstance, a Roman soldier could ask any Roman citizen to carry the burden of another person for up to 1 mile. Now, he wasn't allowed to do it for 2 miles, but he could do it for 1 mile. In other words, it didn't matter what you were doing. You could be dressed in your nicest suit, heading to the most important business meeting of your entire life, but if a Roman soldier is carrying a 50-pound bag of groceries and they don't want to do it anymore, they can say, hey, you in the suit, I want you to carry this for me, and you are obligated to carry it for 1 mile. That might sound familiar because that is exactly what Simon did. When the soldiers said, hey, you carry Jesus' cross. That was actually the responsibility of a citizen to carry the burden of someone else for up to 1 mile. Now, they had no option. They were ordered to do it. It was often inconvenient, and it was usually completely humiliating for the person. And people often resented being stopped in the middle of what they're doing by a Roman soldier and being forced to carry something for 1 mile. But Jesus is literally saying here, go the extreme of the opposite of lax talionis. If someone tells you to go 1 mile, you go 2 miles. You go even further. Don't resent it. In fact, let your life be inconvenienced by other people. I have one of those jobs. My job is a job of absolute inconvenience. That Di and I know that all of our plans are up for change based upon our role as pastor in so many people's lives. We have a job of inconvenience, is literally what Jesus is saying, is that all of you should be willing to live lives of inconvenience. Let your life be interrupted. And don't just do what you should do, what is right. He said, but take it one step further. Go the extra mile. And I say, Jesus, easier said than done. But what do you want to be known as? You want to be known as somebody who goes the extra mile? Jesus says, be known as someone who turns the other cheek. Be known as someone who gives the shirt off their back. Be known as someone who goes the extra mile. And finally, be known as someone who gives to anyone who asks. So Jesus said this in verse 42. He said, you've heard it. He said, give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. He said, so if anyone asks, give to those people. Just give. Go beyond what is required and act generously in every situation. Years later, Augustine was teaching on this text, and he says, Jesus requires us to give to those who ask, but not necessarily what they ask. So it's possible somebody would say, hey, I need you to, do X, Y, and Z for me. And you say, I'll do something for you. It's not going to be exactly what you ask. It's still going to inconvenience me. But you have to, Jesus says, you have to do to those who ask, but not necessarily what they ask. There are certain people that you have in your life, like I have in mine, that the only time they call you or text you is when they need something from you. Aren't those people awesome? Only when they need something. I have somebody who will text my name over and over and over again, and it's always because this person needs something. It's usually because he needs somebody's phone number. What I want to say is go on Realm and get their number yourself. But Jesus says, give to anyone who asks. So my job is, when this person is incapable of going on Realm and getting the number themselves, my job is to go on Realm, find their number, type out their number, and send it back to them. When Jesus says give to anyone who asks, he's saying your job isn't to question their motives. Your job isn't to discover what they want to spend the money on. He said your job is just to be generous. And I will be honest and say that for years, this was something that I struggled with, because I'm a big motive. I want to be incredibly generous, but I want to know what people are going to use the money for. I want it to be wise and responsible in things. And I was wrestling through this text, and I felt like the Lord told me for a year that anyone who asked me for anything, my immediate response had to be yes. And so for a year, anytime I saw somebody beg for money, I gave money. Anytime anybody asked me for money, I gave money. If people needed to borrow something, I didn't just lend it to them, I gave it to them. And I did this for a year. Whatever anyone asked, I just gave. And I would say it was easier said than done. Give to everyone who asks. It's tough. But what do you want to be known for? You want to be known as a generous person? Jesus says you and I should be known as people who turn the other cheek, give the shirt off our backs, go the extra mile, and give to anyone who asks. This passage is so challenging because it's easier said than done. And to do it, it really takes a total trust in Jesus. It's this trust that God is going to be fair. God is going to be just. God is going to make this right for me. And I think the only way that you and I can live that way is if we understand who we represent, that you and I represent Jesus, that we might do something that is completely countercultural and doesn't make sense to our family, doesn't make sense to our neighbors, but we're trying to live out those words of Paul. What as much as it depends on me, I'm going to live peacefully with everyone, that I'm not going to seek out revenge, but instead I'm going to do what is honorable in every situation to all people. And at times I feel totally differently, but I'm going to do it. And it is because I have an overwhelming sense of who I represent, that I represent Jesus. I just close with this thought. I recently Googled worst sports uniforms ever. Worst sports uniforms ever. Every top 10 list of worst sports uniforms ever pops up this uniform. When you saw that uniform, did it bother you? Why did it bother you? Because that is our beloved Seattle Seahawks. And we like whatever the Seahawks do. How dare you say that uniform is ugly or the worst one ever? Because that team represents us. And that is the same way we should feel about the things that Jesus wants us to do. That extremely passionate. I want everybody to bow your heads, close your eyes.